That was a really weird look we just shared just then. Okay, I'm going to try this, and then hopefully things are going to start working. Cool. So I'm pretty terrified of giving this talk at this point, A, because it's the first time I've used web components, done a HTML5 slide deck, and put code samples in the slide deck itself, and then do other code samples along with it. So you know that classic thing where they have the demo gods and everything's going to go wrong whenever you do a demo? It's all going to crash at this point. So yeah, just bear with me and it'll be fine. So yeah, thank you for coming. This is going to be all about web push. So a little bit about me. My name's Matt. I'm a developer programs engineer at Google. I've been doing developer relations for about 5 years. And I've been working on web push for, I think it's about 2 years now. It doesn't feel like it, but I think that's roughly been it. So from the very first implementation of Chrome, I've been doing stuff with web push. I've seen it change over time. I've also been one of the lead engineers for FCM for web, which is like a JavaScript SDK. So I've been doing a ton of this stuff, and I've been really enjoying it. There's tons of stuff that I see developers doing. So we're going to look at how you actually add web push to your site, as well as just a ton of the problems that I see developers hit. So with that being said, what is the overall goal of web push? So you have a website, you have some kind of device. It can be a phone, desktop, whatever you want. Your site is going to do something that's going to say, hey, I want to message this user. So something happens, you get some detail, you send it to your backend. So then your backend has some information about that user, and based on some point in time, you're going to want to send a message to that user. So something else happens from your backend, and it results in a message. That's kind of the ultimate goal of this entire presentation. We're going to look at each of these pieces. So first off, let's look at the site. What do you actually have to do with your existing website? What do you need to add, change, what have you, to actually make it start doing web push? So the first thing is notification prompts. Now, this is the only user visible thing. It's very, very simple, very, very dull, unfortunately, but it's a really important piece. It's the only thing the user has to do. So they have to say, yes, you can send me notifications, whatever you want, block it completely, or they can just ignore it. So they can just dismiss it and nothing's changed. I'm already going to start with a slightly sad bit of this, where it's going to happen a couple of times where the web has actually moved forward for the better, but there's kind of this weird scenario of, that's great, but you've also left me in a bit of a hole now as a result. So this is the original API. There's nothing exciting about it or crazy. Request permission, and you pass in a callback. Old school fashioned. The permission value there is actually going to be granted. You're good to go. You have permission for notifications. Denied, which means you're actually blocked for good. Nothing's going to change until the user changes it. Or default, which means I just dismissed it. I don't care. I'm not made a decision. The reason this API is kind of is it's using callbacks. All the cool kids are using promises nowadays. So the good news is they changed the specs, so now you can actually use promises. It's exactly the same. There's one slight problem with this. There's no way of feature detecting whether it's going to give you a promise or it's expecting the callback. So you end up writing this disgusting mess of code where you have a promise wrapping around the API, and if it uses a callback, it resolves the outer promise. Otherwise, it returns a promise. You check for that, and then you just do all this other stuff. So yeah. What was a very, very simple task at one point with a callback is now kind of interesting. You might be able to get away with it by saying, if they support web push, and that's what I'm using it for, I'll just expect a promise. The early versions of Chrome did not support the promise version, so it depends whether you care about that or not. So you can get around it, but it's just disgusting. Anyway, it's extremely simple. The idea is, if you click run, and I'm just doing the promise version, it says, hey, what do you want to do? There's an interesting thing that I learned doing this talk. So if you click block, you get denied, and you can run this same code, and it's always going to be denied no matter what. That's really bad if you actually do this, because the user is not going to know to click on that information dialog, click on notifications, and ask again. Now, the weird one that I learned while giving this talk, if I ask for permission, and the user closes it, you get default. Now what this used to mean is default, you could keep on asking again. If I now ask for it a second time, it changes to denied, the permission dialog doesn't come up. And the weird thing is I can refresh the page and I can keep on running this and it's always denied. So word of warning, very simple, but you actually really want to make sure the user's going to say yes, because if they don't, you're not going to get their permission to show permission or show notifications. So yeah, anyway, simple API made disgustingly horrible, even though things are trying to be made better. There is another situation this comes up in this talk, and I apologize, but yeah. So we get notification permissions. That's the first thing you need to add to your website. The second one is service workers. How many of you have heard of service workers? OK. How many people have actually implemented anything with service workers? It's like 50% down to a handful. OK, so for anyone who doesn't know what service workers are or haven't properly played with them, here's what they are. So you have your website today. You load up HTML, JavaScript, CSS. Cool. Now, what you can do is register a service worker file, which is just a plain old JavaScript file. Now, what you're doing when you register this JavaScript file is you're basically saying, dear browser, there's this intrinsic link between my website and this JavaScript file. That's all you're kind of doing. Now, the reason this is a good thing and a useful thing is a service worker file, that piece of JavaScript can run without the web page being open, without it even existing as far as the user's concerned. The browser knows that's there, and it can run in the background. The browser is also the thing that determines whether the service worker lives or whether it should be terminated, whether it's needed or not. Now, the nice thing about this is when you have some kind of event, like the browser wants to do something for your website in the background, like a push event, the browser goes, cool, well, what is this push event for? Oh, it's for that origin. That origin has this service worker, so I'll wake it up and I'll make it do something. It doesn't need to involve the web page. There's no UI or anything like that. The user is completely left out of the loop, so it just runs, which is really, really powerful. Flip side of that is you obviously need to worry about, well, what is the user expecting? Does it make sense or not? But that's where you're seeing more and more APIs where it's coming to that point of doing background stuff. It's going in the service worker. So we need to register one for our push. The API for this is very, very simple. Navigator.serviceworker.register, you pass in a file. In this case, all that file is just a console log. There's nothing else inside it. It's just plain old JavaScript, and then it prints yay. So what I'm going to do is to prove that I'm not completely lying. Do I have it there? Yes, cool. So when I click on the console, I'm going to clear all the horrible error messages where I'm doing terrible things. When I click run, that log message is just the log that I mentioned in the service worker file, but we also get this yay on the other side. And if I go to the application tab in DevTools, we can see this service worker here is the one that I just registered. So that's all we're going to do to get started with web push. That service worker is completely dumb. It doesn't matter. All we're caring about is just what do we need to do to our website to make things work. After that, we can change the service worker. So let's go back to slide deck. So yeah, these are two pieces, notification and service worker. With these two things, there's one last bit that we need to do. Once you've done this, we need to get a push subscription. That's the special bit of information that is this user's. You can kind of think of it as an ID very loosely. It's kind of something that identifies that user so that when you want to trigger a push message, you're sending it to that push subscription. So what does a push subscription look like, and how do we get it to send it to our back end? Well, the way we get it is we use this method on our service worker registration that we just got, and we call pushmanager.subscribe. And it takes two values. The first one, the user visible only, equals true. It doesn't matter whether you want to change it, whether you want to include it or not. You have to include it, and it has to be true. If you set it to false, you will not be able to subscribe the user. That is a historical thing, and I'm hoping they will remove it eventually because there's no point of it being there. The entire reason it exists is when you send someone a push, you have to show a notification. That is kind of the intrinsic agreement. The reason for this is there's a general fear of people just constantly sending a user a push message and then doing something horrible in the background and the user never knowing. So the way around that is you have to show a notification. Makes sense. That was added as basically an agreement that you promise you will always show a notification. You're kind of acknowledging it. The problem is, by using push and that being the restriction, you should already know that. But anyway, so yeah, that has to be there. The other thing is the application server key. This looks like a horrible thing. because it has to be a uint 8 array, which to me is a disgusting value and doesn't make any sense. And this is where I come to the second bit of crying, but also kind of happy at the same time. One of my colleagues that I work with, who's one of the authors of the spec, he originally argued why this should stay a uint 8 array, and I explained to him it doesn't make any sense, it's horrible for everyone involved. He actually agreed to change it to be a base 64 string, which is great, because then you can just have a ton of characters, and that's it. The spec has changed, no one's implemented it yet. So for now, you kind of have to do this weird thing of, well, I'll use a function that converts the string to uint 8 array and everything's okay. It's not complicated. JavaScript is just a pain in the ass that you have to worry about these things and kind of pseudo-worry about it. But one day in the future, it'll be great. So in terms of what these keys are, you just generate them, and you just have to keep your own public and private keys. So I actually created a random little website that does just that to a certain degree. This is all they are. You can keep on clicking refresh keys. The entire point is they just have to be a certain number of bytes when they're decoded. And yeah, private key, you keep on your server, you keep it private, funnily enough. Don't share it. The public key you can give away as much as you like. The public key is the only thing that should be in the browser. I will cover what they're used for, but largely the way to think of them is this is the way your app is identifying itself. These keys are your app. So just bear that in mind. As far as it's concerned, whenever you pass that in, you're basically saying, OK, this is me. Yeah. So yeah. And I'm going to cover all the horrible details of what they actually do in the background in a bit. So what does the subscription actually look like? So in this code, registering our service worker, we're calling the registration.pushmanager.subscribe. I'm passing in my public key. And then at the end, I'm going to print out whatever the subscription is at the end, the bit of data that is the user. Boink. So that's what it looks like. Now, the reason I say think of it as an ID for the user is just as a blob is because that, again, is super horrible. Now, the good news is I'm not going to explain what all those things are quite yet, because you hopefully never have to care about any of that stuff whatsoever. Just think of it as a bundle of data that identifies the user. Now, all of that together is all you have to do on the web page. That's it. So I'm going to register a service worker. I'm going to ask for permission, double check that it's all valid. I'm going to subscribe the user. And the last step is going to send it to the back end. So in this case, I am going to send it to the wonderful instance of Firebase that I have set up and praying to God that it doesn't break. Yeah. So all this is doing, subscribing the user, and at the end, it's just taking the subscription, which has all that blob of data, and sending it to Firebase, which is this thing over here. That's all you have to do. And at this point, if you've done this, this is kind of good news, because this is like probably the most tedious chunk of work you'll ever have to do as far as web push goes. Fingers crossed. I've kind of lightly glossed over it in the sense of I'm not worried about UI state. Like, how do you show it to the user in terms of I want to subscribe for push? That's an important part. The other side of it is what happens if they don't give you permission for push? Do you not show the button? Do you disable it? Do you enable it or not? What happens if they already have push? Do you show like, OK, do you want to disable push or not? It's actually pretty simple. It's just you've got to sit there and think of all the different avenues to do all of these things. But once you've done it, that's actually, seriously, kudos. That's the worst bit of stuff over and done with. So that's the first bit. We've got our push subscription over to the back end. Now, I slightly lied when I said your server does something and it goes to the push, and I did this lovely little arrow going down to the phone, and that was it. There's one bit that I kind of skipped over. So when you want to send a push message, your back end doesn't send it to the device, it sends it to a push service. This service, all it's doing is you're just making an API call, and when that service can talk to the device, when it next comes online or it's next connected, that's the thing that will actually send a message to the device. Now, the reason you're doing it this way is that way the device only has to talk to one push service. It doesn't have to listen to a whole bunch of different servers, it's just one. So it's more efficient for the devices in terms of battery power as well as just cognitive load. Yep?
The push service is a feature of the browser. The browser picks the push service for you?
Yes. So the question was, is it the browser that picks the push service? And the answer is yes. So Chrome uses FCM behind the scenes. Mozilla uses auto push. The interesting thing around that is you should never have to care, because every single one should be using the same API. A lot of people ask if they can manipulate it and change a different push service. I think Firefox does if you, the user, change the browser to look for another push service, but it gets super funky and I've never done it. So for now, yes, the browser picks it, but you as a developer should never have to care. Yeah.
But that's the endpoint in the subscription notice?
Yes.
So you use the endpoint, but you always talk the same way?
Yes, exactly. So going on to the next one, this and the next slide are the two most horrible, disgusting slides you will ever see, but I'm also hoping this will terrify you to such a point you will believe the next point that I say when I say use a library. So this is the current state of the world, right? So the subscription has that endpoint, and it has two keys. So starting off with the two keys, the treasure chest is auth. Auth is a secret shared between you and the browser. The browser just makes it up on the fly, and only you two have it. It's just used as a way of making sure that there is some notion of you are who you say you are. The P256, which is part of the subscription, is the public key. Now this is, the browser will generate public and private keys that you have to use when you want to send a message, because you have to encrypt the message. So that's the public key. You can do what you want with it, but the browser hides the private key. You will never see it. So when you want to trigger a push, we send all the bits of information to our backend. So we've got all this information, the endpoint, the auth, and this P256DH. Now when you want to send a push message, you actually have to take the message you want to send, you have to encrypt it into this special encrypted bundle, which is the web push protocol, and that's what you send to the push service. Now the reason you're doing all of this horrible mess is that push service could be anyone. So it could be any endpoint. You don't know whether they're a good person, a bad person, you have no idea. You encrypt it, it doesn't matter because they can't read it one way or the other. So all that push service can do is send that encrypted message down to the device, and at that point the browser will actually go, well, I've received this push message, what is it? At that point it will try and decrypt it using all the information it knows, the public key, the private key, and the auth. It checks it is actually valid. So your web app at this point has no knowledge that anything has happened. It hasn't received the push, nothing's happened. The browser's still dealing with it, but assuming that it actually managed to decrypt the message, that's the point your web app gets it and you can show a notification. So as far as your JavaScript is concerned, you never decrypt anything, you never worry about any encryption whatsoever, because it all happens on your app server and it's decrypted by the browser. This is horrible, I grant you. I have implemented this in 2 different places and it's disgusting. But it's useful to know because one way or another it's kind of a reassuring thing knowing that people's data is actually encrypted and no one's snooping on it. So then there's also this application server key bit. I promise you this is the last disgusting slide. So the application server key, I mentioned that we have this public and private key that is your app. That's the thing that represents you. The blue key here is the public key, the red key is the private key. So when you subscribe a user, what you're doing is you're loading up a web page and you're sending the public key down to the web page. When you call subscribe and you pass it in, what you're actually doing is you're sending the public key to this push service. So now that push service goes, cool, well, I'm going to generate you that push subscription, that blob of data for the user, and I'm going to tie it to this public key that you've just given me. So now I know something about you as well as the user. It'll send that push subscription back to you. At that point, you're going to send that up to your server. I skipped one. So you send it out to your server, and then when you send a push message, you actually also send an extra bit of information with it, which is kind of basically a signed message from you. So you're using your private key, you're signing a message with it, and you're sending it to the web push service. That web push service can now actually decrypt that message because it's got your public key, it knows what endpoint you've tried to do, and it can say, is this actually you who sent this message? And if it is, it'll actually send it. If it's not going to go through. So all that being said and done, and one person leaves the room, thank you. It's horrible. Like I will not lie to you, it's a disgusting mess. The flip side is when you actually come to implementing this side of things, it's not that bad. So enter in a chunk of Node code, and this is it. So this is a Node app that I'm actually going to use to send a push message. all I'm doing here, the important piece is I'm pulling in this library web push. This is a Node library. I'm going to show you an org that has a whole host of other languages. I'm then setting up this thing called Vapid details. Vapid details are your application server keys, the public and private keys. Vapid is the spec name for it that's super unfriendly and disgusting. But that is the important bit of information. That's just where you say, this is my public key, this is my private key. That's where you create that special bundle that you send to the push service saying, this is who I am. You'll notice I also include a mail-to address there. It can be a URL. The only purpose for that is if the push service realizes you're doing something a bit shady, or maybe actually they want to give you a hand because you're sending messages that are a bit wonky or they're going to break you, there's a chance they can message you if they need to. That's all it's for. And then here, I'm calling this other method, send notification. Now, all I'm doing when I'm sending a notification is sending the subscription, which is the endpoint and the 2 keys. And then I'm sending this extra JSON blob as a string, which I'm just saying title, body, and other stuff. So this is actually going to do all the encryption. It's going to take the Vapid details, generate the other random message, and send it off to the push service. So when I hopefully go, so first off, if I enable this, I'm hoping you guys, ooh, that's interesting. That's not going to work. OK, let's turn that off. See what happens. So I'm hoping when I run this script, it's going to go to Firebase. Yay! So thank you. So all that is doing is it's doing all the encryption behind the scenes. You don't worry about it. It makes the network request for you. Everything's beautifully formatted and everything else, and it's actually landed in a notification in the end. The only real thing you have to pay attention to with these libraries, and it's a common thing, is this little bit underneath where I'm listening for errors. Now, this isn't great because generally what will happen is every single library that I've seen would just go, here's the message I got back, deal with it. And realistically, what you want to pay attention to is the status code. So 410, gone. That just means the user's probably cleared their cookies and wiped out all the service workers, and that means they'll wipe out the push subscription as well. Or 404, which is the browser's actually expired your subscription. And this can happen for a couple of different reasons. Maybe you're not showing notifications when you should be. Maybe they tried to expire one and give you a new one. But in both those cases, you need to remove the subscription from your database. And I've seen a good few developers where they don't do this, and they end up in this growing list where they only have like an ever smaller portion that actually is sending pushes and receiving them, and a more larger growing side where they're like, why are more people not getting my push messages? And it's just, that's probably the reason why. So just bear that in mind. That's the only complicated bit. So the point of all of that, A, was to terrify you to never try and do the encryption stuff yourself because it's horrible. The other side of it is we have web push libs. Now, this is an org on GitHub. There's a ton of different libraries, Java, C#, PHP, Node. I'm currently working with someone who's got a Go implementation as well. This has Chrome engineers and Firefox engineers currently looking there in terms of supporting it, working on the libraries, just making sure it works well. And I would strongly encourage you, if you're going to go down this route, please do use one of these libraries. It will make your life a lot easier. If there's problems with docs or the code or anything you want to get involved, please do just raise issues or PRs, what have you. Yeah, it's generally working out pretty well for the libraries we currently have. But yeah, just well worth keeping in mind. I have glossed over a lot of the horrible encryption stuff and the really specific details because personally I don't want to sit here and talk to you about it, and B, I feel like you'd be bored more so out of your skull than you probably currently are. But if you are interested, I've written this content web push book that has a ton of details in terms of all of the gory details of specifically what is happening, what's happening with the application server keys, all these other bits. The only thing that I will call out right now is the web push protocol also has a set of headers that are special and you can send that have basically extra bits of behavior that you can add in. So when I scroll to the bottom, more headers, here we go. So the first one, TTL header, that is the time to live on the web push service. So let's say the users turned off their phone because the battery's died and they're not going to turn it on for the next 3 days because they're busy surfing or something. you might have a message that's only relevant for the next 60 minutes. Like, let's say, flash sale on blah, 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 and you have 60 minutes to buy it now. You can set a time to live on that message of 60 minutes. And what will happen is you'll send it to the push service will get it, and it will store it for 60 minutes. If the user's phone doesn't come on within that time, it will just drop it. It won't deliver it. You don't bother your user, which is a nice feature to have. Other one, topic. Topic is, if you set a topic, you can send a push message. The user has their phone off again. You send a second push message. If it's got the same topic, it will actually drop the first one and replace it with the second one. Urgency, I have yet to see how you'd know whether it's working or not. But basically the idea is if you have a message that's super important, you can set the urgency. If it's super not important, I think the idea is it would help a push service say, should I wake up the device as soon as humanly possible to deliver this super critical message, or should I not? I don't know. But yeah, tons of content there if you are interested in learning more about that stuff. But you don't have to know about it. That's kind of the beauty with these libraries. Other side, if you're pseudo curious, this isn't going to work, is it? No. God damn you, web. If you are kind of semi-serious, curious, oh my God, everything's going wrong. There is this simple push demo, and the nice thing about this is you can kind of start playing around with it, send yourself push messages, but if you look along the bottom, it also shows you the headers that it's including in the message that it's sending. So this does a lot of the encryption behind the scenes in the web page, generates all of the application server key details. It's just, again, if you're kind of lightly curious and you want to see how things are structured, this is one way of doing it. But it's only if you're interested. Like I say, it's not important. Flip side is, if you do want to code your own web push library, kudos, like seriously, I would not, like it's a useful thing. If there's a language that you want to support and it's not out there, seriously awesome. Flip side is, you will probably hate yourself by the end of it, I promise you. But do keep the web push libs org in mind. There are probably languages that we don't support and are needed by someone. So if you do implement it, please do think about asking one of us, like adding it to the org. Like we are super keen for that, and you will get a ton of help and support around it as well, especially if there are any bugs. The other thing to call out at this point, if you start implementing web push, I would recommend the shit out of using Firefox at this point. The reason I say that is they have spent a ton of time with their like console messages, and just generally, if something goes wrong, they are way better at giving you a useful piece of information. Chrome still, I believe, uses FCM, and when you send a message that is wrong, it will actually, you send JSON, and it will just give you HTML back wrapped around JSON, and it's always the same error message that is completely unhelpful. Firefox, on the other hand, has spent a lot of time actually saying, look, this is probably where your problem lies. It's in this header of this thing. So if you do start implementing this stuff and you're getting really stuck, use Firefox. The other thing is Firefox is generally a lot less strict in terms of certain criteria, whereas Chrome is very, very strict. So the flip side is if it doesn't work in Chrome, try it in Firefox. If it does, chances are you've got something that will actually be useful if you raise a Stack Overflow question that means works in Firefox, it's not in Chrome. That information is actually very helpful going, this is possibly where the problem lies. So yeah, kudos to the Firefox team, would definitely recommend using that. Okay. So now we're on to the fun bit. This is, I've seen people do this presentation where they start with this bit at the start because it's the best bit. And this is where you actually just done all the horrible setup, you're sending push messages, and now you actually get to show notifications. This is the push event in the service worker. So remember, service worker, this background task that magically wakes up and does work once a push is actually received. So this is the baseline code that you're all going to have to implement one way or the other. So inside your service worker, you have self.addEventListener push. And in there, you have a callback that will just receive an event. Now, most people, if they've never done worker stuff or service worker stuff, wonder what the hell is self. It literally means the service worker itself. You can kind of think of it as like the equivalent of window in the browser. It just means kind of the global scope. And I've outlined 2 comments. And this is, despite how simple it sounds, it's very easy to get wrong. You have to show a notification one way or the other, we've already mentioned, but you also have to make sure that you pass a promise into event.waitUntil. This is important because you remember how I said the browser kind of decides whether the service worker lives or dies? If you're doing like network requests in the background that take a long time, you kind of need to tell the browser that you're doing that work. Otherwise, it could just say, well, you've been awake for a long time. I'm bored. I'm going to kill you now. So if you pass the promise into event.waitUntil, the browser will wait until that promise is completed. Once it's completed, then it knows, OK, you're done doing work. I will terminate you now. So basic code for showing a notification. That's what this looks like. So you create a title, options. We're going to look at a couple more in a bit. But the important bit is this self.registration.showNotification. That will show the notification to the user, and it will return a promise. The one thing to bear in mind is you must return a promise into event.waitUntil that has finished or resolved after you've shown a notification, which in this case is obvious, like it's show notification of the promise. That promise won't complete until we've shown it, but it's very, very easy to get wrong. So in this case, I have a totes amazing notification for you all. It's BMO. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying the title is this does compute, boom. I've got a body message, credits to the person who did it, who's here. Icon, which is the big BMO up there. Badge you won't see on this one, but it will on Android. It's like a little teeny tiny thing. And then I've got two action buttons here, which are the I Heart BMO and Play Video Games. Now, this is kind of introing you to the notion of the fact that you can do action buttons up here, and it's just introducing you to icons and badges and everything else. The other thing that I did add to this, if I've remembered it correctly, did I add it to this? Let's see. Is when I click on I Heart BMO, that's it. So as well as that, the actions can start being hooked up to additional bits of action, like logic within your service worker. The other thing is when you click on the actual notification itself, it reacts differently, and I'm opening up Windows. And the code for this is pretty simple. Actually, I'll cover it later on in a minute. Yeah, let's do that. So all of this is nice and simple. There's a ton of stuff that show notification can actually do. We're going to look at all the stuff in a minute. But first, this is the one thing to look out for. And if you see this, it means one thing. So this site has been updated in the background. Now, this will actually show up if you don't show a notification. It's pretty terrifying to users with good reason. But the other side of it is you may also get to a scenario where you show a notification, you have actually done the right thing, but you will also get this notification shown up. So the user's seeing two from your website, and you've only sent one web push. The reason this tends to happen is you haven't got a good promise chain. So can anyone spot the possible flaw in this code? I'm actually going to wait. No, I'm not. So what we're doing is we're saying event.waitUntil, that's fine. We're passing in a promise from fetch. We're doing some extra work. And then at the end, we're showing a notification. The problem is we're not returning the notification promise. So you're entering in this very, very subtle, very easy to miss race condition where if show notification has an icon in it that it needs to download, which takes a very long time for some reason, it could get to the point where event.waitUntil, seen this promise, it's finished, the browser goes, cool, you've shown a notification, right? You haven't because you're downloading the icon, at which point it goes, I'll show the default notification. Afterwards, you show your notification. Everything is just a bit icky. It's very easy to miss. So whenever you see that, that's the first thing you should look for, is just make sure that your promise chain is working. The other one is your code has thrown an error, you haven't caught it, shown a default notification, and you're still in the same boat where it's going to show the default notification. So it's a very subtle one, but it's worth just making sure you cover all the cases there. The other one little tip, and I see a lot of developers do this, except they do tons of things, one after the other, in this big, huge blob, and it doesn't read well. It's still JavaScript. You can rip things out into functions. You can pull things apart. The other thing that I'm encouraging more people to do, at least when they start out, is doing this kind of weird, like, just make sure you get a promise back from a function and then pass it in so it's extremely clear, like, that is the thing that's going in. But pull things out into functions. It's still a JavaScript file. There's no reason to blob your code in this one big, horrible event listener mess. It's a very subtle thing, but I see a lot of developers doing it. I think it's because you're new in terms of service workers, there's a ton of debugging stuff. Just remember, it's still just JavaScript. So I showed you the BMO thing where I clicked on a button, it did something, or you clicked on something else and it opened up the Wikipedia article. This is the code that does it. So beyond just push, listeners, you also have notification click. Now, notification click, funnily enough, the users clicked on something. So when you clicked on one of the action buttons, we had event.action became a thing, and you said the user clicked on blur. You can do anything you want there. It's entirely up to you. That's just one example. But then I also do this open window. And when I do that, I'm telling the browser, wait until I've actually opened the window again. But you can start doing tons and tons of funkier stuff in here. You can actually get access to all the windows that belong to your origin. So you can get an entire list and say, what websites do I currently have open for me? And start saying, well, actually focus on that window. Or actually, I want to go do this instead. Yeah. The other event, I'm going to mention it because I think the only scenario that people want this is for analytics. They want to know how many of these notifications were clicked on, like interacted with and good, how many of them the user just dismissed because they thought were useless and didn't like it. If they just dismiss it, notification close get called. It's not that useful in terms of anything other than making sure that you follow what people are actually using, but it's worth mentioning. So I mentioned there's tons of features that you can do with your notification. One of the things that I've seen a lot of people use is tags. So this is a notification without a tag. This is basically the code that we ran before, where if I click on it, if I do it a couple of times, you just get a growing list of notifications. Chances are you can figure out in your web app that's not desirable. If you happen to send 3 notifications, you probably don't want 3 things shown up. And you can define the tag any way you want. So here we have an example with a tag. So here I've just gone, tag is BMO. And that's all it is. It's just a string. It's an identifier. But now when I click on run, you'll notice the timestamp is changing. So you can have as many tags as you want. You just group them together by a message. So you can imagine like an instant messenger might say messages-John, messages-Dave, and then you can start replacing those messages. The browser will just deal with it for you. It's very, very subtle, but very, very nice feature. The other thing is I've been saying from the start, you must always show a notification. It's not quite true. I always say that because I think a lot of people look for the how do I do a silent push? How do I do a push without anything happening? And I don't want you to think in that mindset. But if the user currently has your web page open, and it can be any of the pages on your origin, you don't have to show a push message. That makes sense, right? Like, you don't want to bombard them if they're already on the website. So the way you can get around it is, well, not around it, the way you check whether you need to show a notification or not is by looking for the window clients. It's also a good way of figuring out what windows are open that you own. So clients.matchAll, we're saying type window. I think because that's, you can also look for workers if you really wanted to. We also say include uncontrolled. That's a reference to service workers. I would say in pushland, you always want uncontrolled. And then we get this list of window clients. This is every single tab the user has open for your origin. And then we're going through each one and we're saying, is the window client focused? The minute you find one that is, that means you don't need to show a push message. You can just completely bail out at that point and just say, cool, I won't show a notification. The browser will not show its default notification. You're all good. It's a very minor thing, but I think for a user experience standpoint, it's very, very good. And there are a ton of other ones that I'm not going to go through. But again, if you go to the web push book, I have this section on it. Which one's good? Oh, this one. So you can add data to a notification. So let's say you receive a push message, you make a couple of API calls, and you want to save some data. So when they click on it, you do something with that information. So let's say, hey, we've just introduced this new blog post, check it out, and you add the blog post URL. What you can do is add that to the notification. When they click on it, you pull the data out of that notification, say, what was the URL that I received a push for? Oh, it's this one. I'll open up a window for that. Minor code. The other one that I would say is very, very interesting from my standpoint is the idea of merging notifications. So you've received a new push message, and I showed you with tags, you can swap them out. But you might want to do something a bit more interesting, like saying, well, what was the last thing that I received? Pull data out of that and do something else. So it's kind of implementing the same behavior, but you can get much more intricate with it. So one of the use cases is the idea of if you send a push message for a new message, you can say, hey, you've got a new message from Matt. Here's the message. When you send a second one and they haven't interacted with the first one, you can go through the list of currently open notifications and say, they've already got one from Matt, so I'll swap out and just say you have 2 new messages from Matt. And you can just keep on incrementing, just changing the data on the notification and just keep on going. It's kind of nice in the sense of if you want to do some really funky stuff, you can do. The other thing that people normally ask me is, how do I do analytics with this stuff? Short answer is, out of the box, no one is going to give you a good analytics solution, at least none that I'm aware of. But the flip side is it's just JavaScript. So you can carry on making network requests for all of these events. If you do a search for analytics in web push, there is a Stack Overflow post that is the top result that has a solution. It uses Google Analytics and a special measurement protocol thing. It's very simple, but it's actually kind of nice because you can start tracking how many messages are being received, how many are being clicked on versus closed, all that good stuff. The other thing, and I mentioned this as a side note because if you do start implementing this and you're kind of curious, it's kind of a pet project that I want to play with. These are still events, and if you think of like touch events, they normally bubble down and then bubble back up, so you could have multiple touch listeners. It's exactly the same with listeners and service workers. You can have multiple push listeners in one service worker, and one could sit there and go, cool, I received a push, going to make an analytics call, come back, and then the following push thing go, cool, now I'm going to show a notification and do other stuff. So in theory, if you had a network provider, you wanted to have one team dealing with that, you could actually have them listening for the events and doing other cool stuff, and then you can do the notification bit. I don't know. Just a random note. Again, it's just JavaScript. This is probably the one thing where I kind of see a lot of people do a certain set of things, and it really kind of irks me. So the first one, and I apologize, Vice News and head of this, and they have fixed it since I found this screenshot. When you landed on Vice News, this is what you saw. And the reason this really upsets me most is this is a pattern that I'm seeing more and more, and I'm getting much more aggressive at blocking people. I feel slightly responsible for it as well, which is even worse. So basically, you land on this web page and it asks you for permission to show you notifications. There's absolutely zero context on what you're going to get as a result. It kind of sucks. They have fixed this now, so it's all fine. They've got a new site and everything. But please just don't do this. Again, it's that whole thing of I can say don't do this and people will still do it, but please just, you'll land on a website that does it and you'll be like, damn it, I shouldn't have done that either. The other one, if you actually hit subscribe, and this is arguably worse, so you allow them notification permissions, you can't disable it. Like that's it. So the only way you can now get a user to unsubscribe this is on the notification. They have to click on the settings icon. That puts them in a horrible thing in Chrome, which admittedly is a Chrome issue. But you're asking them to do a ton of work to disable notifications for your site because they never clicked on anything to say, yeah, I agree to push notifications. Instead, it came up, they've agreed, and now there's no settings panel. There's nothing there that says disable. This is arguably the worst bit for me, in my opinion, is just when a website just does this and there's no get out. So please be mindful of when you're doing this stuff, just what the UX is. I know I've glossed over it in the start of this presentation, like this is how easy it is. But please bear in mind, like you have to think of how a user signs up, what they're going to get, what their expectations are, and then how they unsubscribe as well. That's just as important. So yeah, please just be mindful of that. The other thing, and this is more subtle, and I'm going to say it, this is probably the first kind of notification everyone will show because it's just boilerplate, you're just playing around with stuff, it's fine. Please just don't ship with it because most users will not enjoy this kind of thing. And again, this is a Facebook kind of before and after scenario. That information is fine. Like it technically is correct. It's just not good compared to what it could be. They're exactly the same information. The other thing that is still kind of wrong is here, Facebook. This is another common thing. People want to put their website brand at the top. And it's kind of obvious from the fact the URL's there. The user subscribed from that website. You don't need to repeat it. Instead, you've got more opportunity to add more content that's relevant to the reason why they got the push. So again, I say this, and I only keep it very light because I've seen people do whole talks on the UX of push notifications. And you can say all of that, but it's just one thing that I feel like this is a nice, simple rule. just to keep in mind.
Got a question for you.
Yep.
So you're making a distinction between these two, but what if you had 7 notifications? Would you rather see the one encapsulating them all than to see a whole bunch of individual ones? Or is the argument here that you'd rather have something more descriptive, in which case you're only getting a single one here, as opposed to if you really had multiple?
So the question is, if you had multiple ones, would it make more sense to be descriptive? Like,
Well, to encapsulate, the top one's correct. Let's say you had 7
Yeah.
notifications.
yes.
The bottom one's an example of a single one.
Oh no, like I'd argue if you had 7 notifications, they probably won't be from the same source. They'll be from multiple. So at that point, it's just a case of what is the context for each of those things. I think the question is, if you had this same notification from Facebook, which arguably, like, both of these could come from any IAM, and they're both equally valid versions of the same notification. I'm arguing that this one is much, much better in the sense of, A, that's a face that I should recognize. It's going to be relevant. The message tells me, OK, there's a message from someone called Matthew, and that's the message, as opposed to, you have a new notification. It might be important. It might be not.
My argument is that at Facebook, if you're getting a notification from 20 different friends on Facebook, I'd
Yep.
rather just see the top one. Say, oh, you got multiple notifications.
So that's more of an implementation question of, do you, the owner of the website, collapse, rather than have 7 notifications, collapse it down to X number? And yeah, that's totally valid. And that's the point where you could say, well, what notifications do I have open? Who are they for? OK, now I'm going to collapse that one down from 1 person to 2 people, down to 4 people. So I totally agree. I think the question is, what do you show first? I'd argue you should show that first, rather than you have a notification from 1 person.
Yeah, if it were single.
Yeah. I think the question is, again, try and be as descriptive as you can that makes sense. But yeah, you're right. You have to consider it. I feel like a lot of people, they stick with this thing because it's the first thing that works, and that's fine, but you can do so much more that's much more useful to the user. This is more of, don't worry about it today, but it's coming in the future very soon. This one at the top is probably the most relevant. I say this because I believe more browsers are going to start using it very soon. Is this push subscription change? Now, what this is basically saying is this will trigger in your service worker, and if you have a push subscription and you've subscribed that user and they're good, it may be that after 3 months, the browser's like, look, you've subscribed this user for 3 months. Just to be safe, we're going to expire that subscription. We're going to give you a new one. This event will be the thing that will fire, regardless of whether you're listening or not. So you want to listen for this event and say, OK, that means there's a new subscription. I'll get it, and I'll send it to my back end. That's all you need to do in this event. At the moment, no browser's really implementing it. Firefox kind of has, but it was like a pre-spec'd behavior way that's kind of weird. But I think over time, if you go play with this stuff, do think about it in the next, like, I don't know, 3 to 6 months. Come back and make sure you're implementing this event, because it's probably going to be important. The other thing, and this is much more optional, is, and the only reason I mention it is because you might have to do something, is where you send that push subscription up, it's just that blob of data. You might want to start grabbing this value and sending it up with it. The only reason I say that is it might get to a point where push library is going to encrypt things differently based on this value. And it's not going to be immediate change. It could be years down the line. But if you don't have it, you may find you're breaking users without realizing it. I've talked to people who have implemented this, and I am a bit upset that it's completely separate, because they assure me nothing will break. But at the same time, I don't understand why it's added if it won't break, and it is a change. So be wary. The other thing is there are changes to the application server key stuff, but that's the wonderful world of libraries where you should never have to worry about it and everything will be fine. Those are only just bits to keep in mind. So with that, that is everything that I was going to talk about. I think I'm OK. So yeah, I hope it's been useful.